Cold wind howls over a barren, snow-covered forest. A lone crow croaks and flies off into the endless white. There is a silence in the forests of the north, a silence so deep it feels less like the absence of sound and more like a presence, heavy, suffocating, watchful. The air itself carries weight, biting at exposed skin, seeping into bone. Winter here is not a season, it is a world, a frozen dominion stretching as far as the eye can see, where the endless white devours both horizon and hope. And in that world, one hunger grows stronger than all others. Not the sharp pang of a missed meal, not the ordinary growl of an empty stomach, but something far darker. A hunger that gnaws not at the body, but at the soul itself. When that hunger grows strong enough, when desperation strips away memory, love, and law, the line between human and monster begins to blur. That is where the Wendigo waits. The story of the Wendigo belongs to a place, not just any forest, but the Great North Woods, a vast belt of boreal wilderness that crowns North America from coast to coast. This is no gentle place. Its soil is thin, its winters long, its silence is not peaceful, but predatory. For thousands of years, people have survived here, but never conquered it. The Algonquian-speaking nations, Cree, Ojibwe, Mi'kmaq, Innu, learned to move with its rhythms, to respect its laws. To them, the forest was alive. Every tree, every animal, every gust of wind held spirit and intention. Survival was not dominance, it was balance. And balance meant one rule above all: never take more than you need. Because to break that law, to let greed or desperation overwhelm respect, was to awaken something far worse than winter. It was to call the Wendigo. A family huddles around a dwindling fire. Outside, the storm rages. Inside, silence. Sometimes, even respect for the land was not enough. The caribou would fail to return. The fish would not rise through the ice. The carefully stored food would run out. And in those desperate winters, a terrible thought would creep into the minds of the starving. When the last scraps are gone, when every trap is empty, when every belly aches with unrelenting hunger, what do you do? The Algonquian peoples knew the answer must always be the same. You do not eat the flesh of another. To cross that line was to risk more than survival. It was to invite corruption, a cold that no fire could ever drive out. It was to open the door to the Wendigo. The Wendigo was not merely a beast of the woods. It was not something you hunted or fled from. It was a spirit, an embodiment of winter itself. The cold, the hunger, the emptiness. It traveled on the wind, whispering into weak hearts, seeking vessels. The lonely, the starving, the greedy. And once it found a body to inhabit, it did not simply kill. It hollowed the soul, leaving nothing but a gnawing hunger where a human heart had been. A man's shadow grows taller, thinner, monstrous. The person stretched unnaturally tall, yet withered to bone and skin. Their eyes burned with an inhuman light. Their lips gnawed away, teeth forever bared in hunger. They became something both gigantic and skeletal, cursed to grow hungrier with every meal, doomed never to be full. A paradox in flesh. A Wendigo. The Algonquian peoples feared it not only as a hunter in the night, but as a symbol. The Wendigo was greed itself, the selfish leader who hoarded food while others starved, the hunter who took more than the forest offered, the man who betrayed his kin to feed his own appetite. These were not just bad men, they were Wendigos in the making. The monster was a warning, a story that carried the weight of survival, and as long as the winters of the north stretched on, the Wendigo's shadow stretched with them. In a world alive with spirits, some benevolent, others malicious, every community needed a guide, a person who could walk between worlds, a healer, a prophet, a warrior of the unseen. They were called shamans. To the Algonquian peoples, shamans were not simply healers of bodies, they were healers of souls. Through dreams, visions, and trance journeys, they navigated the dangerous landscape of the spirit world, bargaining with powers beyond mortal sight. And when the Wendigo stalked a community, it was the shaman who stood at the front line of that battle. The first sign of a Wendigo was not claws scratching at the door. It was dreams, a dream of being lost in a white storm, a dream of skeletal figures moving among the trees, a dream of flesh, raw and bloody, consumed by your own hands. These were no ordinary nightmares. They were warnings, alarms in the soul. The Wendigo had noticed its next victim. When someone confessed such dreams, the shaman would listen carefully, then slip into trance to confront the spirit. If the visions were confirmed, the entire community mobilized, for they knew, once the Wendigo had chosen a host, time was running short. One of the most dramatic ceremonies was the rite of the shaking tent, a small lodge, a temporary vessel for immense power. The shaman would crawl inside, sometimes bound with ropes to prove there was no trickery. Outside, the people gathered in the darkness, waiting. Inside, the shaman called to the spirits, and the forest answered. The lodge shook violently as if caught in a storm. From within came voices, animal, human, something in between. The people asked questions and the spirits replied. This was no spectacle. This was war. If the spirits confirmed the Wendigo's presence, the community knew they must act, and fast. The afflicted would begin to change. They would grow distant, withdrawn, refusing food, shivering as if ice itself had taken root in their chest. This was called Wendigo sickness. A race against time. Either the spirit was expelled or the person would be lost forever. The cure was as shocking as the sickness. The shaman, with the family's help, would force the sufferer to swallow hot, rendered animal fat, spoonful after spoonful. Sometimes a hardened stick of grease was jammed down their throat. The logic was simple. The Wendigo was cold. Its heart was ice, and only heat and fat could melt it away. If the ritual succeeded, the person would vomit violently, and the spirit would be expelled. If it failed, then the transformation was complete. The person was no longer kin. They were a Wendigo. And a Wendigo could not be cured. It could only be destroyed. The execution of a Wendigo was not vengeance. It was protection. The body was killed by bullet, by fire, by blade. But that was only the beginning. The true enemy was the heart of ice. The frozen heart was cut out, placed on a sacred fire, and melted until no shard remained. Only then could the community rest, knowing the spirit had been banished. But beneath the horror was always the lesson. The Wendigo was more than a monster. It was greed itself, hunger without end. The man who hoarded food while others starved. The leader who placed power above kin. The hunter who took more than the forest offered. Each one risked the same fate as the cannibal in the woods. Each one was already on the Wendigo's path. Into the world of shamans and spirits came new men from across the ocean. Men dressed in black robes, their breath heavy in the cold. They carried books instead of rattles, crosses instead of drums. They were Jesuit missionaries. In the 17th century, these men left the great cities of France to walk into what they believed was a godless wilderness. They came with one mission: to replace spirits with saints, shamans with priests, and to bring what they called the light of Christ into the dark forests of the north. To the indigenous nations, they were outsiders. To themselves, they were soldiers in a war for souls. The Jesuits wrote everything. In their journals, known as the Relations, they recorded the languages, the customs, the ceremonies they witnessed. But their eyes were not those of anthropologists. They were theologians. When they listened to stories of the Wendigo, they did not hear a spirit of hunger, born of winter and desperation. They heard something else, a demon, a servant of Satan, haunting the wilderness, preying on the souls of the unbaptized. The shaman's shaking tent was, to them, witchcraft. The Wendigo spirit was not an elemental force of starvation. It was a devil, and the only weapon was not ritual fire or rendered fat, but the cross. Some Jesuits claimed they had exorcised the Wendigo with prayer. They wrote of brandishing the crucifix, of invoking Christ to banish the monster. To them, every tale of the Wendigo was proof of Satan's kingdom in the north. And yet, for all their zeal, they misunderstood. They could record the words, but not the meaning. They could see the fear, but not the wisdom. The Wendigo was never simply a demon to the Algonquian peoples. It was a mirror, a story about balance, about greed, about the fragility of the human mind. But the Jesuits had no category for such a thing. To them, monsters came in only two forms: angel or devil. So their accounts, the first written records of the Wendigo, became both invaluable and flawed. They preserved the details, but stripped away the context. They gave us the story, but not the soul. By the 1800s, the world of the Wendigo had already begun to change. Colonial expansion pressed deeper into the forests. The great buffalo herds, lifeblood of the Cree and other nations, were vanishing under the rifles of settlers. Famine grew. And it was in this world, a world where indigenous ways of life were collapsing under the weight of colonization, that the Wendigo legend bled into something darker and tragically real. His name was Swift Runner, a respected hunter, a guide, a man trusted by both his people and the settlers. In the winter of 1878, he led his family deep into the woods to survive the cold. They never returned. When spring thawed the rivers, only Swift Runner stumbled back. Alone, his eyes were haunted, and his story, darker than anyone could have imagined, would become the most infamous Wendigo case in history. By every account, he was not an outcast. He was respected, a strong hunter, a trusted guide for the Hudson's Bay Company, and even the Northwest Mounted Police. But in the winter of 1878, something inside him broke. When he returned from the forest in spring, he told a terrible story. The game had vanished. His wife, his 6 children, his mother-in-law, his brother, all had perished of hunger. He alone had survived. The priests at the mission mourned with him. Starvation was no stranger to the North. His tragedy seemed cruel, but believable, until they looked closer. For a man who claimed to have starved through the winter, Swift Runner looked well-fed, too well-fed. The priests grew uneasy, the police grew suspicious, and the Cree elders whispered what no one wanted to say aloud: Wendigo. A patrol was formed. Swift Runner himself was asked to guide them back to his winter camp. The journey was long. His once proud confidence was gone, replaced with silence, hesitation. He claimed he had forgotten the way, but the officers pressed on. And then, they arrived. There were no graves. Instead, bones were scattered across the camp, cracked open for marrow. Inside the lodge, human remains. A cooking pot stained with fat. A child's moccasin, small, fragile. This was no story of starvation. It was slaughter. Swift Runner had consumed his family. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed. But his confession was stranger still. He claimed he had not acted of his own will. He said a spirit had taken him, that a Wendigo had entered his heart, frozen it with ice, and filled him with a hunger no man could resist. He was not the killer, he insisted. He was the victim. In 1879, Swift Runner stood trial in Fort Saskatchewan. For the Canadian court, his explanation was meaningless. Spirits had no place in the law. His story of possession was taken not as a defense, but as a confession. He was found guilty. On December 20th, 1879, Swift Runner was led to the gallows. To the colonial government, his execution was proof that law and order now ruled the wilderness. But to the Cree witnesses who watched, it was something else. It was a ritual, the destruction of a Wendigo. They said that in his final moments, when the black hood was placed over his head, Swift Runner fought with unnatural strength, letting out an inhuman scream that chilled every witness. To some, it was a condemned man's desperation. To others, it was the Wendigo itself, roaring in defiance before the rope snapped tight. Swift Runner's case was not the only one, but it was the most infamous, a moment when ancient belief and colonial law collided in blood and horror. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a new explanation emerged. Doctors and early anthropologists began to write of Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome. They argued it was not a spirit at all, but a sickness of the mind. Starvation, isolation, and fear, combined with the deep cultural taboo of cannibalism, could trigger a psychological break. The hunger was real, the visions were real, but the Wendigo, they claimed, was not. Yet for the Cree and Algonquian peoples, this explanation was too neat, too cold. Was it truly madness? Or had the doctors simply given the Wendigo a new mask to wear? Because whether spirit or sickness, the result was the same. Families shattered, lives consumed, and the hunger endured. As the 20th century dawned, the world that had given birth to the Wendigo began to change. The old semi-nomadic ways of life were shattered. Starvation hunts grew rarer. The isolation of the deep winter lodge began to vanish. And with it, the Wendigo as a lived fear began to fade. But the Wendigo did not die. It transformed. Writers discovered it first. In 1910, Algernon Blackwood wrote The Wendigo. He borrowed the name, the northern forests, the sense of dread. But he changed the monster. Blackwood's Wendigo was not the spirit of greed and cannibalism. It was something stranger, an elemental being of the sky, dragging victims through the treetops, burning their feet to ash. It was no longer a moral warning. It was cosmic horror, a glimpse into the vast and indifferent universe. And his story set the tone for everything that followed. H.P. Lovecraft's circle soon adopted it. August Derleth folded Blackwood's Wendigo into the Cthulhu mythos, renaming it Ithaqua, the Windwalker. Now it was no longer an Algonquian spirit at all, but a cosmic god, a great old one, part of an alien pantheon. The transformation was complete. The Wendigo was no longer a warning whispered in winter lodges. It was a monster in fiction. From there, the Wendigo became a pop culture drifter, a nameless creature in low-budget horror films, a shadow in TV anthologies, a hungry monster in comic books. The name itself had become shorthand, a signal for something terrible in the woods. But the soul of the story, the taboo, the hunger, the warning against greed, was left behind. Stephen King revived it in Pet Sematary. Here, the Wendigo was not seen, but felt, an evil force poisoning the land, corrupting those who trespassed. Millions of readers, millions of viewers in theaters, all carried the word Wendigo into their nightmares. By the late 20th century, a new image appeared, a tall, skeletal figure with the skull of a deer, antlers like jagged crowns. It was not from folklore. It was from film sets, comic panels, and internet art. But it stuck, visually striking, terrifying, unforgettable. The antlered Wendigo quickly became the dominant image. So much so that most people today imagine antlers when they hear the name. And then came video games. In 2015, Until Dawn introduced the Wendigo to a new generation. Teenagers trapped in a snowbound lodge, a mountain cursed by cannibalism. And when the taboo was broken, the spirits of hunger rose. The game's monsters were not antlered nor skeletal giants. They were fast, shrieking insect-like horrors, born from folklore, redesigned for fear. For millions of players, this became the definitive Wendigo. And so, after centuries, the Wendigo completed its journey, from sacred story to colonial misunderstanding, from cultural caution to psychiatric diagnosis, from the lodge to the court to the page to the screen. Today, it is many things: a horror icon, a video game monster, a set of antlers on a movie poster. But what it began as is something far deeper. The Wendigo was never simply a creature in the trees. It was a truth about the human heart, a warning that hunger, when it becomes insatiable, is the most dangerous spirit of all. That greed, left unchecked, can consume not only the body, but the soul. The Wendigo is not gone. It walks with us still, not always in the woods, but in every place where appetite grows without end. Beware, the Wendigo is everywhere and exists.